The crystal flute in my hand trembles, a tiny, nervous tremor that mirrors the frantic beat of my own heart. Around us, the polite murmur of the corporate gala, usually a backdrop I can ignore, suddenly sharpens, every syllable a needle. Mark, my husband, stands beside me, his arm a possessive weight around my waist, his smile a practiced, charming veneer I once found irresistible. Now it just looks like a mask. He's been regaling his colleagues, his voice a little too loud, buoyed by expensive champagne and the sycophantic laughter that always follows him. I'm just an accessory, a silent, smiling prop. Then his boss, Mr. Henderson, claps him on the shoulder, a genuine smile on his face. Mark, you've outdone yourself this quarter. Stellar work. Mark's chest puffs out.
Thank you, sir.
I aim to please. And of course, he says, his voice taking on that familiar condescending drawl he reserves for moments he thinks make him look magnanimous. I couldn't do it without a supportive home life. He squeezes my waist, a gesture that feels less like affection and more like a claim of ownership. Then his gaze sweeps over the listening group, landing on a younger associate, a pretty blonde who's been openly flirting with him all night. A smirk plays on Mark's lips. Though, truth be told, he continues, his voice booming slightly, catching the attention of nearby conversations. Keeping things stable on the home front is a full-time job. Especially when, well, he pauses for dramatic effect, and a cold dread begins to seep into my bones. I know that tone. I know that glint in his eye. He's about to say something cruel, something to diminish me, to make himself look bigger. Let's just say, some people are better at closing deals than keeping a man. If you catch my drift, he winks, a conspiratorial, ugly gesture, and a wave of tittering laughter, laced with discomfort from some, ripples through the group. His eyes meet mine, a cold, dismissive gleam in them. She can't even keep a man, he mouths silently to me, a cruel, private joke made public. The world tilts. The champagne in my glass seems to curdle. My smile freezes, a painful rictus. The laughter, the lights, the scent of expensive perfume and ambition, it all presses in on me, suffocating. He's done it. He's actually said it out loud, in front of everyone. The humiliation is a physical blow, stealing my breath, burning my cheeks. I feel 100 pairs of eyes on me, some pitying, some scornful, some just morbidly curious. And in that moment, something inside me, something I thought had died long ago, sparks. A tiny, cold, hard ember of fury. He thinks this is his victory lap. He has no idea what's coming. The air in this room, thick with forced laughter and the clinking of glasses, suddenly feels like water, and I'm drowning. If you've ever felt that wave of public shame, that moment where you wish the earth would just swallow you whole, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me share these stories, more than you can imagine. Our life, before the rot set in, had the deceptive sheen of a well-polished photograph. We met in college, Mark all brash confidence and easy charm, I the quiet, studious one, drawn to his light like a moth. He pursued me with a relentless energy that I mistook for passion, for a depth of feeling that mirrored my own burgeoning affection. We married young, the ink barely dry on our diplomas. His career in finance took off almost immediately, a steep, glittering trajectory that fed his ego and our lifestyle. I found a job in a small publishing house, editing manuscripts, a quiet, fulfilling pursuit that I loved. But as Mark climbed higher, the space for my ambitions, my voice, seemed to shrink. Our apartment, once a cozy haven filled with shared dreams and whispered secrets, began to feel more like a showroom for his success. The minimalist furniture, the art chosen for its investment value rather than its beauty, the dinner parties where I was expected to be the gracious, silent hostess, it all reflected him, not us. I remember the early days, the genuine partnership. We'd spend hours talking, planning, dreaming. He'd listen to my stories about the authors I worked with, the narratives I was shaping. He even feigned interest in the delicate dance of prose and plot. I, in turn, would try to understand the complex world of mergers and acquisitions he navigated, celebrating his victories, soothing his defeats. There was a balance then, or so I believed. My salary, though modest compared to his soaring bonuses, contributed to our joint account. My dreams, though quieter than his roaring ambitions, felt valid, acknowledged. I wanted a family, a home filled with warmth and books and the laughter of children. He'd agreed, vaguely, someday, when the time is right, a someday that kept receding further into the horizon as his career consumed him. The first crack, the one I papered over with denial, appeared about 5 years into the marriage. He was up for a big promotion, and the stress was palpable. He started coming home later, smelling of expensive whiskey and a perfume that wasn't mine. When I gently questioned him, he'd erupt in anger, accusing me of being suspicious, of not understanding the pressures he was under. "You have your little book job, Sarah," he'd sneer. "What do you know about real stress, real stakes?" His words stung, a sharp, unexpected pain. My little book job, as he called it, was my passion. It was where I felt competent, valued. But in his eyes, it was insignificant, a hobby. I retreated, telling myself it was just the stress talking, that the Mark I loved was still there, buried beneath layers of ambition and anxiety. The dismissiveness grew, like a subtle poison seeping into the foundations of our marriage. My opinions on everything from current events to what movie to watch were increasingly brushed aside. Dinner conversations became monologues about his achievements, his challenges, his brilliance. I became a sounding board, an echo chamber. If I dared to offer a differing viewpoint or speak about my own day, his eyes would glaze over, or he'd cut me off, impatient to return the spotlight to himself. The man who once looked at me with adoration now seemed to look through me. I found solace in my work, in the quiet companionship of books, and in a small, secret hobby I'd cultivated. Years ago, my grandmother had left me a modest inheritance, a few $1,000s I'd been too afraid to touch, too sentimental to spend. One rainy afternoon, feeling particularly adrift, I started researching investments. It began as an intellectual exercise, a way to engage my mind outside the increasingly sterile environment of my marriage. I read books, followed financial news, opened a small brokerage account. It was my secret world, a place where I was in control, where my decisions mattered. I started with safe, boring stocks. Then gradually, as my confidence grew, I branched out, making small, calculated risks. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about proving to myself that I was capable, intelligent, that I had agency. Mark never knew. He handled all our joint finances, and my small inheritance was mine alone, a detail he'd long forgotten, if he ever registered it at all. He often joked about how clueless I was with money, how I needed him to manage everything. I never corrected him. It was easier to let him believe his own narrative. The desire for a child, once a shared dream, became another point of contention. My gentle reminders about my biological clock ticking were met with irritation. "We can't afford the distraction right now, Sarah," he'd say, despite his 6-figure salary and extravagant spending on cars and boys' trips. My career is at a critical stage. His career was always at a critical stage. I realized, with a chilling certainty, that someday would never come. He didn't want a child to complicate his perfect, self-centered life. He didn't want to share the spotlight, not even with his own offspring. He wanted a partner who was an extension of himself, not an individual with her own needs and desires. The loneliness became a constant companion, a dull ache in my chest. I was married, yet I felt utterly alone. The vibrant, hopeful young woman I'd been was fading, replaced by a subdued, careful version of myself, always treading on eggshells, desperate to avoid his displeasure. But even my caution couldn't prevent the inevitable. His contempt, once a subtle undercurrent, was about to break the surface in the most public, humiliating way imaginable. The company gala, the one where my world tilted on its axis, wasn't just any corporate event. It was the annual Visionary Awards, a night where Mark's firm celebrated its top performers. He'd been nominated for a major award, something he'd been angling for, obsessing over for months. The pressure in our apartment, in the weeks leading up to it, had been suffocating. Every conversation revolved around his chances, his speech, what he would wear. I was tasked with finding the perfect dress, something elegant but understated, something that wouldn't outshine him. I chose a simple, deep blue silk gown. I felt good in it, a flicker of my old self. But when I showed it to him, he barely glanced up from his phone. "Fine, whatever. Just make sure you don't embarrass me." That was his only comment. The ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Mark was in his element, gliding through the crowd, shaking hands, his laughter booming, a little too forced, a little too loud. I trailed in his wake, the dutiful wife, smiling until my face ached. He'd been drinking steadily since we arrived, his usual 2-drink limit conveniently forgotten. With each glass of champagne, his voice got louder, his jokes more daring, his charm more aggressive. I saw the way some of his colleagues' wives looked at me, a mixture of pity and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe they saw their own silent compromises reflected in my eyes. Then came the moment. Mr. Henderson, Mark's boss, a man I'd always found decent and respectful, approached our little circle. He was genuinely pleased with Mark's performance. "Mark, you've outdone yourself this quarter." "Stellar work," Mark preened. His response started innocuously enough, thanking Henderson, acknowledging his team. But then his eyes, alight with alcohol and arrogance, found mine. There was a cruel, playful glint in them, a look that always preceded a jab at my expense. He launched into that awful, condescending spiel about needing a supportive home life, the words slurring slightly. And then, the punchline, delivered with a wink to the pretty, young associate who'd been fawning over him. "Let's just say, some people are better at closing deals than keeping a man." If you catch my drift, he didn't just say it. He broadcast it, his voice carrying in a momentary lull in the ballroom's chatter. A few nervous titters, a collective intake of breath. Then, as if that wasn't enough, as if he needed to drive the knife deeper, he turned to me, his face inches from mine, and mouthed, for my eyes only, or so he thought, "She can't even keep a man." The words hit me with physical force. My breath hitched. The blood drained from my face, then rushed back, burning my cheeks with a furious, helpless blush. The crystal flute in my hand, the one I'd been holding onto like a lifeline, slipped. It didn't shatter, just thudded onto the plush carpet, champagne splashing onto the hem of my blue silk dress. A small, dark stain, a symbol of the much larger stain he'd just imprinted on my dignity. For a horrifying second, I thought I was going to be sick, right there in front of everyone. The polite smiles around us froze, then morphed into expressions of awkward discomfort. Even the pretty associate looked momentarily abashed, though she recovered quickly, a small, triumphant smirk touching her lips. Mr. Henderson looked profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Mark and me, a frown etching itself onto his forehead. Mark, oblivious or simply not caring about the carnage he'd wrought, just grinned, pleased with his own wit. He actually thought he was being funny, charming. The silence that followed stretched for an eternity. All I could hear was the frantic thumping of my own heart and the echo of his words. "She can't even keep a man." It wasn't just an insult. It was a public declaration of my failure, not just as a wife, but as a woman, according to his twisted definition. He was erasing my worth, my identity, reducing me to a punchline in his success story. In that instant, something shattered within me, not my spirit, but the last vestiges of love, of loyalty, of hope for the man I had married. The image of the charming college student, the ambitious young husband, the partner I thought I had, dissolved, replaced by the cruel, arrogant stranger standing before me. The pain was immense, a gaping wound. But beneath the pain, something else stirred. A cold, hard resolve. He had drawn a line. He had shown me, unequivocally, who he was. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I could no longer be the woman who stood by his side and absorbed his casual cruelty. This was not just an insult. This was the inciting incident. This was the moment the story changed. The immediate aftermath of his words is a blur of suffocating silence and averted gazes. I remember mumbling an apology about the spilled champagne, my voice sounding distant and shaky even to my own ears. Someone, a kind-faced older woman I vaguely recognized as another executive's wife, gently took my arm and murmured something about finding a cloth. Mark just shrugged, a dismissive gesture, already turning back to his fawning audience, eager to reclaim the spotlight.
He didn't even look at me.
It was as if I'd ceased to exist the moment I was no longer a useful prop or a convenient target. The stain on my dress felt like a brand. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the expensive carpet and never be seen again. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I plastered a brittle smile on my face, nodded at the appropriate times, but inside, I was a hollow shell. Every laugh, every congratulatory remark directed at Mark felt like a fresh stab. He accepted his award later that night, his speech full of false modesty and carefully constructed charm. He even had the gall to thank his wonderful, supportive wife, blowing a kiss in my direction. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I clapped along with everyone else, my hands numb, my heart a stone in my chest. The car ride home was silent, but it was a heavy, charged silence, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Mark was drunk, humming to himself, pleased with his successful evening. He didn't seem to notice my stony silence, or if he did, he didn't care. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, each one a tiny pinprick in the vast darkness, mirroring the tiny, sharp pains in my soul. When we got back to our apartment, the luxurious space felt cold and alien. I went straight to the bedroom, stripping off the blue silk dress, now marred by the champagne stain, and dropped it onto the floor. I wanted to burn it. Mark stumbled in a few minutes later, reeking of alcohol and self-satisfaction. "Great night, huh?" he slurred, fumbling with his tie. "Told you I'd nail that award." I didn't respond. I couldn't trust myself to speak. The words were lodged in my throat, a bitter, choking lump. He finally seemed to register my silence. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. "Still sulking about that little joke? God, Sarah, you're so sensitive. Can't you take a bit of teasing?" Teasing. My voice was low, dangerously calm. "You call publicly humiliating me teasing, Mark?" He scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, here we go. Drama queen. It was a joke. Lighten up." Everyone else thought it was funny. "No, Mark," I said, my voice gaining strength. "They were laughing because they were uncomfortable. Because you were being a cruel, arrogant bully." His face darkened. The drunken good humor vanished, replaced by a familiar scowl. "Oh, I'm the bully now? For stating a fact? Let's be honest, Sarah. Our marriage hasn't exactly been a shining success story lately, has it? Maybe if you put a little more effort into things, instead of moping around with your nose in a book all the time." That was it. The dam broke. Years of suppressed anger, frustration, and hurt came pouring out. Effort. I practically shrieked. "I've put my entire life on hold for you, Mark. For your career, for your ego. I've cooked, I've cleaned, I've hosted your goddamn clients. I've listened to you drone on about yourself for hours. I've smiled and nodded while you belittled everything I care about. What more effort do you want? Should I get Mark's property tattooed on my forehead?" He recoiled, genuinely shocked by my outburst. I rarely raised my voice. I was the quiet one, the accommodating one. "Now you're just being hysterical," he said, trying to regain control. "Hysterical?" I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "No, Mark. I'm finally being honest. That joke tonight? That wasn't just a slip of the tongue. That was you showing everyone exactly how little you think of me. She can't even keep a man, is that what you really think?" He had the decency to look away, a flicker of something, shame? Or just annoyance at being challenged. In his eyes, it was just words, Sarah. Drunken words. It didn't mean anything. It meant everything. I whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of me, leaving behind a cold, desolate emptiness. It meant you have no respect for me. No love for me. Maybe you never did, he started to protest, to offer some lame excuse, but I held up a hand. Don't. Just don't. I walked over to the closet and pulled out a suitcase. His eyes widened. What are you doing? I'm leaving, Mark. The words hung in the air, simple, stark, terrifyingly real. You can't be serious, he stammered, the arrogance momentarily replaced by disbelief. Over a stupid joke? It was never about the joke, Mark. It was about everything. I gestured around the opulent bedroom. This life you've built, it has no room for me. Not the real me, anyway. I packed a few essentials, my hands trembling but my resolve firming with each item I placed in the bag. He watched me, a strange mixture of anger and confusion on his face. He tried to argue, to cajole, to threaten, but his words bounced off the wall of newfound determination I was building around myself. For the first time, his opinions, his anger, didn't penetrate. It was like I was watching him from a great distance. When I was done, I walked to the door. Where will you go? He asked, his voice suddenly small. I don't know yet, I said, and it was the truth. But anywhere is better than here. I left him standing there, amidst the trappings of his success, a bewildered look on his face. As I closed the apartment door behind me, I felt a strange sense of lightness, of fear mingled with a terrifying, exhilarating freedom. The first struggle was simply surviving that first night. I ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind with flickering neon signs and threadbare carpets. The anonymity was a strange comfort. I lay on the lumpy bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, the events of the evening replaying in my mind like a horror film. His words, the laughter, the pitying looks, each memory was a fresh wave of humiliation. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced, grappling with the enormity of what I had done, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a hollow feeling in my stomach. The adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a chilling dose of reality. I had no plan, very little money in my personal account. Mark controlled our joint finances with an iron fist, and nowhere to go. My first instinct was to call my sister, but I hesitated. Explaining the situation, admitting the failure of my marriage, felt like another form of humiliation. My pride, though battered, was still intact. I needed to do this on my own. My first practical step was to find a more permanent, albeit temporary, place to stay. I spent the day searching online for affordable short-term rentals, my stomach churning with anxiety every time I saw the prices. Mark hadn't called. Not a text, not a missed call. Part of me, the part that still foolishly hoped, felt a pang of disappointment. The other, more realistic part knew this was typical Mark. He was probably sulking, expecting me to come crawling back, full of apologies. I found a small, furnished studio apartment in a less fashionable part of town. It was tiny, a little rundown, but it was clean and, crucially, it was mine. Moving my few belongings in felt both liberating and terrifying. The silence in the small room was deafening after years of living with Mark's constant presence, his booming voice, his endless demands. For the first few days, I barely left the apartment. I subsisted on takeout and instant coffee, replaying Mark's insult over and over. She can't even keep a man, the words had burrowed deep, fueling a toxic cocktail of shame and anger. I tried to work, to focus on the manuscripts I'd brought with me from the publishing house, but the words on the page blurred. My concentration was shot. My editor called, concerned. I mumbled something about a family emergency, promising to catch up. The lie tasted bitter. One evening, staring at my meager bank balance, a wave of panic washed over me. Mark had always handled the bills, the investments, everything. He'd made it clear he thought I was incapable of managing finances. You stick to your books, Sarah, he'd say patronizingly. Leave the numbers to me now. His words echoed with a new, menacing implication. How would I survive? My salary from the publishing house was modest. It was enough to cover the rent on this tiny studio and basic necessities, but not much more. The life I'd been accustomed to. The dinners out, the nice clothes, the occasional vacation was gone. More pressing, though, was the emotional toll. Friends, mutual friends mostly, started calling. Their voices were laced with awkward sympathy, their questions carefully phrased. Who had Mark told? What version of the story was he spinning? I imagined him playing the victim, the bewildered husband whose overly sensitive wife had inexplicably walked out. The thought made my blood boil. Some calls were clearly fishing expeditions, attempts to gauge the situation, perhaps even to report back to Mark. I learned to be vague, non-committal. The isolation was crushing. I had walked away from my marriage, but in doing so, I felt like I'd walked away from my entire life. The early struggles weren't just about logistics. They were about battling the voice in my head, the one that whispered Mark's words, the one that questioned my decision, my ability to make it on my own. Was he right? Was I just being overly sensitive, hysterical? Had I thrown away a comfortable life over a drunken insult? But then I'd remember the coldness in his eyes, the casual cruelty, the years of subtle dismissiveness, and the resolve would harden again. This wasn't just about an insult. This was about reclaiming myself. My days settled into a grim routine. Wake up, force down some coffee, try to work, fail, stare at the walls, sleep fitfully. The initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a gnawing anxiety about the future. Mark still hadn't made any significant effort to contact me, aside from a single, terse text message a week after I left. Are you done with this tantrum yet? People are starting to ask questions, no apology. No concern. Just annoyance and a focus on appearances. That text, more than anything, solidified my decision. It was clear he saw my departure as an inconvenience, a childish outburst, rather than a consequence of his own actions. The people are starting to ask questions line was particularly galling. His reputation, his image, that was all that mattered. I didn't reply. What was the point? The financial pressure began to mount. My small savings were dwindling faster than I'd anticipated. The security deposit on the studio, the first month's rent, basic groceries, it all added up. I started meticulously tracking every penny, a habit I'd never needed before. I ate instant noodles and cheap sandwiches, a stark contrast to the gourmet meals Mark had insisted on, either cooked by me to his exacting standards or enjoyed at expensive restaurants. The irony wasn't lost on me. He, who accused me of being unable to manage money, had created a situation where I was forced to become a reluctant expert in frugality. My work at the publishing house suffered. My editor, a kind, perceptive woman named Eleanor, called me into her office. "Sarah," she said gently, "is everything all right? Your output has dropped, and frankly, the quality isn't up to your usual standard. The dam of my composure, already weakened, finally broke." The whole sordid story came tumbling out. Mark's dismissiveness, the public humiliation, my desperate escape. Eleanor listened patiently, her expression a mixture of sympathy and quiet anger on my behalf. When I finished, tears streaming down my face, she reached across the desk and took my hand. "Sarah," she said, her voice firm but kind, "you did the right thing. No one should have to endure that." Her validation was like a balm to my wounded spirit. "Take some time off," she offered. "A week, 2 if you need it. Clear your head. We'll manage." I was overwhelmed with gratitude. Her kindness was a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. During that time off, I tried to regroup. The quiet of my tiny apartment, initially a source of anxiety, slowly became a sanctuary. Without Mark's constant presence, his criticisms, his demands, I began to hear my own thoughts again. They were tentative at first, fragile, but they were there. One afternoon, rummaging through a box of old papers I'd brought from the apartment, I stumbled upon the statements for my grandmother's inheritance, the brokerage account I'd been quietly managing for years. I'd almost forgotten about it in the turmoil of the past few weeks. Curiosity piqued, I logged into the account online. I hadn't checked it in months. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The small, carefully chosen investments I'd made, the ones Mark would have scoffed at as hobby money, had grown significantly. One particular tech stock, a company I'd researched meticulously, believing in its innovative approach, had skyrocketed. It wasn't a fortune, not by Mark's standards, but it was enough. Enough to give me a cushion, enough to give me options. A wave of elation, quickly followed by a strange sense of vindication, washed over me. Mark, with all his financial acumen, his arrogance about his superior understanding of money, had no idea. He dismissed my quiet efforts, my intellect, just as he dismissed me. And all along I'd been building this small nest egg, this secret weapon. The discovery of my unexpected financial cushion shifted something within me. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the proof of my own competence, my own quiet foresight. Mark's narrative of me as a financially clueless, dependent wife was just that, his narrative, not reality. This realization fanned the ember of fury that had been smoldering since the gala into a steady flame. It wasn't a hot, reckless anger anymore, but a cold, focused determination. He had underestimated me. He had dismissed me. He would not get away with it.
But how?
What could I possibly do? Divorcing him was a given, but that felt passive, like simply removing myself from the equation. I wanted more. I wanted him to understand, truly understand, the magnitude of his misjudgment. I started thinking about Mark's world, the high-stakes finance, the corporate backstabbing, the obsession with status and power. That was where he lived, where his identity was forged. If I was going to make an impact, it had to be there, in his arena.
But how?
I was just a book editor, a woman he considered insignificant. The challenge seemed insurmountable. I continued my research into the stock market, now with a renewed sense of purpose. My little hobby became an obsession. I devoured financial news, analyst reports, company prospectuses. I learned about venture capital, angel investing, the intricate dance of funding and growth. My mind, starved for intellectual stimulation beyond editing manuscripts, absorbed it all like a sponge. One evening, I was reading an industry journal, a rather dry publication Mark used to leave lying around, when a small article caught my eye. It was about a new tech startup, Innovate Solutions, that was seeking a final round of seed funding. The company specialized in data security, a burgeoning field. What made me pause was the name of one of their strategic advisors, Mr. Henderson, Mark's boss. A strange idea began to form in my mind, a wild, audacious thought that made my heart beat faster. What if? What if I could become an investor in that company? The company Mark's own boss was involved with? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a long shot, a ridiculous long shot. I probably didn't have enough capital, even with my recent gains. And even if I did, why would they consider an unknown, inexperienced investor like me? Yet the idea took root, a tiny seed of a plan. It was a way to confront Mark, not with accusations or tears, but with undeniable, irrefutable success. To meet him on his own turf, not as his dismissed wife, but as a player in his own game. The thought was so audacious, so contrary to everything I'd ever been, that it almost made me laugh. But the laughter died in my throat, replaced by a steely resolve. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about rewriting the narrative, not just for him, but for myself. The path to becoming an investor in Innovate Solutions was fraught with challenges I could barely comprehend at first. My initial excitement about the idea quickly gave way to the daunting reality of my own limitations. I had a decent sum from my wisely managed inheritance, more than I'd ever possessed, but was it enough to make a meaningful investment in a tech startup, especially one advised by someone like Mr. Henderson? These ventures usually required significant capital. I spent days, then weeks, immersed in research. I learned that Innovate Solutions was indeed looking for a final, smaller round of funding to bridge them to a larger Series A. This was a sliver of hope. Perhaps they weren't only looking for multi-million-dollar checks from established venture capital firms. Maybe there was room for a smaller, strategic investor. The first hurdle was figuring out how to even approach them. I couldn't just call up Mr. Henderson. The thought of him connecting me, Sarah, Mark's supposedly clueless wife, with a serious investment opportunity, was ludicrous. It would expose my hand too early, and besides, he'd likely dismiss me out of hand, assuming I was overwrought or simply didn't understand the complexities involved. I needed another way in. I scoured LinkedIn, looking for anyone connected to Innovate Solutions. I found a few mid-level employees, but no clear path to the decision-makers. My publishing world contacts were of no use here. This was an entirely different universe. The frustration was immense. It felt like trying to scale a sheer cliff face with no ropes. Doubt began to creep in. Was this whole idea just a fantasy? A product of my anger and hurt? Was I in over my head? Mark's condescending voice echoed in my mind. "You stick to your books, Sarah." I pushed it away, fiercely.
No.
I wouldn't let his voice dictate my actions anymore. I remembered my grandmother, a pragmatic, resourceful woman who had quietly built her own small business from scratch after my grandfather died young. She used to say, "If the front door is locked, try the back window. If that's barred, check the chimney. There's always a way, if you're stubborn enough to find it." My back window came in an unexpected form. Through a deep dive into online forums and investor communities, I discovered that Innovate Solutions was going to have a small presence at an upcoming tech symposium. It wasn't a major pitch event, more of a showcase for emerging companies. Their CEO, a young, driven innovator named Alex Chen, was scheduled to give a brief talk.
This was my chance.
A slim one, but a chance nonetheless. I booked a ticket to the symposium, using a chunk of my precious capital. The cost made me wince, but I knew I had to take the risk. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing, not for a formal pitch, but for a potential conversation. I researched Innovate Solutions inside and out, their technology, their market position, their competitors, their potential growth areas. I even read Alex Chen's academic papers from his university days. I wanted to understand not just the business but the mind behind it. I wasn't just going to offer money. I was going to offer informed interest, genuine understanding. This was where my skills as an editor, my ability to dissect narratives and understand underlying themes, came into play in an unexpected way. I was analyzing a company, not a manuscript, but the principles of deep reading and critical thinking were the same. The day of the symposium arrived. I dressed carefully, not in the expensive, constrained attire Mark preferred for me, but in a smart, professional outfit that made me feel confident and capable. The venue was buzzing with energy, a cacophony of tech jargon and ambitious chatter. I felt like an imposter, a wolf in sheep's clothing, or perhaps more accurately, a sheep trying to sneak into the wolf's den. Alex Chen's talk was impressive. He spoke with passion and clarity about his company's vision. Afterwards, he was immediately surrounded by a throng of people, mostly men in expensive suits, all vying for his attention.
My heart sank.
How could I possibly compete? I waited, patiently, on the periphery, watching for an opening. It felt like hours. People came and went. Finally, there was a momentary lull. Taking a deep breath, steeling my nerves, I approached him. "Mr. Chen," I began, my voice surprisingly steady. "I was very impressed by your presentation. Your approach to polymorphic encryption is particularly innovative." He turned, a polite but slightly distracted smile on his face. "Thank you." He was clearly ready to move on to the next handshake, the next potential big investor. This was my one shot. "I've been following Innovate Solutions for a while," I continued, trying to project a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "I was particularly interested in your white paper on decentralized data integrity. I had a question about its application in the healthcare sector, specifically regarding patient data privacy regulations." His eyebrows rose slightly. My question was specific, informed. It wasn't the usual generic praise. He paused. "That's a good question," he said, his attention now more focused. "The compliance landscape in healthcare is definitely a challenge, but also a huge opportunity." We talked for a few minutes, not about funding, but about technology, about the market, about the challenges his company faced. I didn't mention money. I just asked intelligent questions, shared a few of my own insights gleaned from my research. I could see his initial polite dismissal morph into genuine interest. Finally, he glanced at his watch. "Look, I have to run to another meeting, but this has been unexpectedly insightful. Do you have a card?" My heart leaped. I hadn't even dared to hope for this. I fumbled in my bag and produced one of the simple, understated business cards I'd had printed. Sarah Miller. Private investor. It felt ridiculously pretentious, but it was all I had. He took it. Sarah Miller, he read. I don't believe we've met. Are you with a firm? No, I said, keeping my voice even. I invest independently, he nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. Well, Sarah Miller, it was a pleasure. Perhaps we can continue this conversation sometime. And then he was gone, swallowed up by the crowd. I stood there, trembling slightly, a ridiculous grin spreading across my face. I had made contact. I had planted a seed. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The rising challenges were far from over, but for the first time, I felt a genuine flicker of hope that my audacious plan might actually be possible. The path was still uphill, but at least now I could see a faint trail. The conversation with Alex Chun at the symposium was a crack of light, but the days that followed were filled with a gnawing uncertainty. Would he call? Had I made enough of an impression? Or was I just another face in the crowd, quickly forgotten? I replayed our conversation 100 times in my mind, dissecting every word, every nuance. The wait was agonizing. I tried to distract myself with my editorial work, which Eleanor had kindly allowed me to do freelance from home. The income was a trickle, but it kept me afloat and gave me a semblance of normalcy. My tiny apartment, once a symbol of my reduced circumstances, started to feel like a command center. The walls were covered in sticky notes with research points about innovate solutions, financial projections, potential risks, and rewards. It looked like the den of a madwoman, but to me, it was a war room. A week passed, then 10 days. My hope began to dwindle. Maybe I'd misread his interest. Maybe my unexpectedly insightful contribution was just polite symposium speak. Mark's mocking voice resurfaced in my weaker moments. Who do you think you are, Sarah? Playing in a league you don't belong in. I was on the verge of chalking it up to a brave, but failed attempt when my phone finally rang. An unfamiliar number. My heart leaped into my throat. Hello. I answered, trying to keep my voice calm. Sarah Miller? This is Alex Chun from Innovate Solutions. We met at the tech symposium last week. I could barely breathe. Yes, Mr. Chun. Hello, please call me Alex, he said, his voice friendly, professional. I was impressed with our conversation. You clearly know our space. I've been meaning to call. We're in our final stages of a seed funding round, and we're considering a few smaller, strategic investors who can bring more than just capital. Your insights on potential market applications were intriguing. Would you be open to a more formal discussion? Open? I wanted to scream yes from the rooftops. Instead, I managed a composed, yes, Alex. I would be very interested. We scheduled a meeting for the following week at his office. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. This wasn't just a casual chat anymore. This was a pitch. My pitch. I had to convince him, and potentially his team, that Sarah Miller, former editor, estranged wife of a finance bro, was a worthy investor. I refined my understanding of their business model, their financials, or what I could glean from public information and educated guesses. I prepared a small presentation, not just about why I wanted to invest, but what I thought I could bring to the table beyond money, my research skills, my analytical abilities, a fresh perspective perhaps untainted by a purely finance-driven mindset. I even practiced my pitch out loud in my tiny apartment, pacing back and forth, addressing an imaginary board of directors. I felt ridiculous, but I knew I had to be flawless. The day of the meeting, I was a bundle of nerves. Innovate Solutions was housed in a trendy co-working space, all exposed brick and glass, buzzing with youthful energy. Alex greeted me warmly and led me to a small conference room. 2 other people were already there, his co-founder, a tech whiz named Ben, and a stern-looking woman named Maria, who I later learned was their legal counsel and an early angel investor herself. The pressure was immense. I felt like Daniel in the lion's den. I took a deep breath and began my presentation. I spoke about my belief in their technology, my analysis of their market potential, and then the trickiest part, I spoke about myself. I didn't reveal my personal situation with Mark, of course. I framed my interest as a private investor looking to diversify, with a keen interest in disruptive technologies. I highlighted my research abilities, my analytical skills honed through years of dissecting complex narratives. I tried to turn what might be perceived as a weakness, my lack of a traditional finance background, into a strength, offering a different kind of due diligence. They listened intently, asking sharp, probing questions. Ben drilled down on the technical aspects, Maria on the financial projections and risk assessment. Alex watched me, his expression unreadable. I answered as honestly and thoroughly as I could, admitting when I didn't know something, but emphasizing my willingness to learn, my commitment. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, I was emotionally and mentally exhausted, but I felt I'd given it my best shot. As I was leaving, Alex walked me to the door. "Thank you for coming in, Sarah," he said. "You've given us a lot to think about. We're meeting with a few other potential investors this week. We'll be in touch by the end of next week with our decision. Another week of waiting. Another week of agonizing uncertainty." This time, the stakes felt even higher. I had put myself out there completely. Rejection would be a bitter pill to swallow. During that week, Mark finally decided to escalate things. Perhaps his people were asking too many questions, or perhaps his ego simply couldn't handle my continued absence. He started calling, not me, but my sister, my parents, even a few of my old college friends, spinning a tale of a confused, emotionally unstable wife who had inexplicably abandoned him. He painted himself as the bewildered, concerned husband, desperate for my return. My sister called me, furious on my behalf, but also worried. "Sarah, he's making you sound crazy," she said. "You need to do something." His campaign of misinformation was deeply unsettling. He was trying to control the narrative, to discredit me before I could even find my footing. It was a classic Mark tactic. If you can't win the argument, destroy your opponent's credibility. This news, however, didn't crush me as it might have a few weeks earlier. Instead, it fueled my resolve. His attempts to paint me as weak and unstable only made me more determined to succeed with Innovate Solutions. This investment wasn't just about financial independence anymore. It was about proving him wrong, about reclaiming my identity from the caricature he was trying to create. It was my midpoint shift, the moment where my personal struggle and my professional ambition became inextricably linked. The anger was still there, but it was now a focused, cold rage, channeling itself into an unwavering determination. His attempts to undermine me only strengthened my resolve. He was poisoning the well, but I was busy digging my own, deeper and cleaner. The week crawled by. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped, only to sink when it was just a spam call or a text from a well-meaning but misinformed friend relaying Mark's latest fabrications. The weight of it all, the potential investment, Mark's smear campaign, the sheer uncertainty of my future, was immense. There were moments when I almost buckled, when the thought of just giving up, retreating into anonymity, seemed overwhelmingly tempting. What was I trying to prove, and to whom? But then I'd remember the cold, hard glint in Mark's eyes at the gala, the casual cruelty of his words, and the fire would reignite. I wouldn't let him win. I wouldn't let him define me. Finally, on Friday afternoon, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line, Innovate Solutions, Investment Decision. My hands trembled so violently I could barely click it open. I scanned the first few lines, my breath caught in my throat. Dear Sarah, following our meeting and subsequent internal discussions, we are pleased to inform you. I didn't need to read any further. A wave of dizziness, of pure, unadulterated elation, washed over me. I sank into my cheap desk chair, tears streaming down my face. Tears of relief, of triumph, of disbelief. They had said yes. I, Sarah Miller, was going to be an investor in Innovate Solutions. They wanted me, not just my money, but me, my insights. The amount they accepted was a significant portion of my capital, a real stake, not a token gesture. It was less than what a big VC firm would inject, but it was meaningful. It made me a legitimate player. The official paperwork, the due diligence from their side, the legalities, it all happened in a blur over the next few weeks. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman recommended by Eleanor to review everything. She was expensive, another drain on my resources, but I knew it was crucial. Mark, meanwhile, continued his campaign. He'd left increasingly angry voicemails, alternating between feigned concern and outright threats about the consequences of my actions on our reputation. He even had his lawyer send me a letter, a vaguely threatening document urging reconciliation and hinting at legal action if I continued to abscond from my marital duties. I filed it away with a grim smile. He had no idea what was coming. He was fighting a battle on a field I had already vacated, while I was preparing for a war he didn't even know was being waged. The deepening crisis wasn't just about Mark's external attacks, it was also internal. The responsibility of this investment weighed heavily on me. This wasn't just my grandmother's inheritance anymore, it was my future, my chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. What if I'd made a mistake? What if Innovate Solutions failed? The tech world was notoriously volatile. The fear of failure was a constant companion, a cold shadow at the edge of my newfound confidence. There were sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I was playing a high-stakes game, and I was all in. There were practical challenges, too. Transferring the investment funds was a nerve-wracking process. Seeing that much money leave my account, even for a purpose I believed in, was terrifying. It felt like stepping off a cliff, hoping a parachute would open. During this period, I had a few brief, professional interactions with Alex Chun and his team, mostly via email and conference calls, finalizing the details. They were respectful, focused, treating me like any other investor. There was no condescension, no hint that they saw me as anything other than a serious partner. Each interaction bolstered my confidence, chipping away at the insecurities Mark had so carefully cultivated in me for years. One afternoon, Alex called me directly. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a note of excitement, "we're having a small, informal get-together for our key seed investors next week. A chance to meet each other, celebrate closing this round, and discuss next steps. Mr. Henderson will be there, of course. We'd love for you to join us." My blood ran cold. Mr. Henderson, Mark's boss, the man who had witnessed my public humiliation, the man whose respect Mark craved above all else. This was it. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching, whether I was ready for it or not. The crisis was deepening, not just in terms of risk and pressure, but in the unavoidable collision of my old life and my new. The invitation to the investors' get-together sent a jolt of pure adrenaline mixed with icy dread through me. Mr. Henderson would be there. This wasn't just a business meeting anymore. It was a potential collision of worlds, the one I had escaped and the one I was trying to build. My first instinct was to decline, to find some excuse. The thought of facing Mr. Henderson, of the possible awkwardness, the unspoken questions in his eyes, was terrifying. He'd last seen me as Mark's humiliated wife, a victim. How would he react to me in this new context, as an investor in a company he himself advised? But then, the image of Mark's smirking face at the gala, his dismissive words, flashed in my mind. "She can't even keep a man, no." I wouldn't hide. I wouldn't shy away. This was part of the journey, part of reclaiming my narrative. This was my turning point, the moment I decided not just to survive, but to actively step into the spotlight of my own making, whatever the consequences. I spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety and meticulous preparation. Not just for the business aspect of the meeting, but for the psychological battle I knew I might face if not with Henderson directly, then within myself. I chose my outfit with extreme care, a tailored, charcoal gray pantsuit, professional, understated, but undeniably powerful. It was armor. I reviewed my notes on Innovate Solutions on the other potential investors I might meet, ensuring I was prepared for any discussion. I also steeled myself for the possibility of Mark somehow finding out, of him trying to interfere or cause a scene. He was unpredictable when his ego was threatened. The thought of a public confrontation with him, in front of Alex Chun and Mr. Henderson, was a nightmare scenario. But I couldn't let that fear paralyze me. I had come too far. The evening of the get-together arrived, a cool, crisp autumn night. The event was being held at a private dining room in an upscale restaurant, the kind of place Mark frequented, full of hushed tones and expensive art. As I walked in, my heart hammered against my ribs. Alex Chen greeted me warmly at the door, his smile genuine. "Sarah, glad you could make it." He introduced me to a few of the other investors, men and women who exuded an air of quiet confidence and intelligence. They were welcoming, curious, their questions about my investment thesis sharp but respectful. I held my own, surprised by how natural it felt to discuss cap rates and market penetration strategies. The editor who once obsessed over split infinitives was now fluently speaking the language of venture capital. Then, across the room, I saw him, Mr. Henderson. He was talking to Alex, a glass of wine in his hand. He hadn't seen me yet. My breath hitched. This was it. Alex, noticing my gaze, gestured for me to join them. "Robert," Alex said, turning to Mr. Henderson, "I'd like you to meet one of our newest and brightest investors." Sarah Miller. Mr. Henderson turned, a polite, professional smile on his face. His eyes met mine. For a fraction of a second, his smile faltered, a flicker of surprise, of confusion, in his expression. He knew me. Of course, he knew me.
Sarah.
Mark's wife. The woman publicly shamed at his company's gala. I saw the recognition dawn, the mental gears turning as he tried to reconcile the image of the humiliated spouse with the confident woman Alex Chen had just introduced as a bright investor. I held his gaze, my expression calm, professional, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was the moment, the turning point where the past and the future converged. I would not flinch. Mr. Henderson recovered quickly, his professional demeanor snapping back into place. The slight frown of confusion was replaced by a carefully neutral expression, though I could see a spark of curiosity, perhaps even respect, in his eyes. "Ms. Miller," he said, extending his hand. His voice was even, giving nothing away. "A pleasure to meet you officially. Alex has spoken very highly of your insights." I shook his hand, my grip firm, my voice steady. "Mr. Henderson, it's a pleasure. I've been very impressed with Innovate Solutions and Alex's vision." There was a beat of silence, a moment where the unspoken hung heavy in the air. The memory of that awful night at the gala, Mark's cruel words, my visible distress. I could see him processing it, connecting the dots. But to his credit, his professionalism held. He didn't mention Mark. He didn't allude to our previous, unfortunate, non-introduction. He treated me as Alex had introduced me, an investor. "So, Sarah," he said, shifting seamlessly into business mode, "what particularly attracted you to Innovate Solutions?" It's a competitive space. This was my cue. My moment to step out of the shadow of Mark's making and establish my own identity in this new arena. I spoke clearly, confidently, about my research, my belief in their unique technology, their leadership team, and the specific market niche I believed they could dominate. I didn't try to oversell. I just stated my analysis, the same points I had made to Alex and his team. Mr. Henderson listened intently, nodding occasionally, his gaze sharp and appraising. It was a completely different dynamic from any interaction I'd ever had in his presence before. Then, I was Mark's silent, decorative wife. Now I was a peer, a fellow stakeholder, albeit a much smaller one. The shift was palpable. As we spoke, I could feel a subtle change in the atmosphere around us. Alex Chen watched, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. The other investors who had drifted over to listen seemed intrigued. I wasn't just Mark's wife anymore. I was Sarah Miller, investor. The rest of the evening passed in a similar vein. I engaged in conversations about market trends, growth strategies, potential exit opportunities. I asked questions. I offered opinions. I was treated as an equal. The fear I had carried into the room began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, growing sense of self-assurance. This was where I belonged now. This was the new Sarah. The turning point wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but a subtle, internal shift validated by external acceptance. It was the realization that I could not only survive in this new world but potentially thrive. The real test, of course, was yet to come. The thought of Mark, of his inevitable discovery of my new role, loomed in the background. But for tonight, I allowed myself to savor this small, significant victory. I had faced down a ghost from my past and emerged not unscathed, but stronger, more determined than ever. I was no longer waiting for fate to deal me a hand. I was actively shaping my own destiny. The final piece of the puzzle, the confrontation with Mark, was now inevitable, and for the first time I felt ready for it. The week following the investors' dinner was strangely calm, the eye of the storm. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the fragile peace wouldn't last. Mr. Henderson was a man of discretion, but the financial world, especially at the level Mark operated in, was smaller than it seemed. Sooner or later, word of my investment, my new association with Innovate Solutions, and by extension, with Henderson himself, would reach Mark. I didn't know how he would react, but I anticipated fireworks. My lawyer and I had already begun divorce proceedings, serving Mark with the papers at his office. I'd heard through the grapevine my sister, who still had a reluctant line of communication open with one of Mark's less obnoxious friends, that he was furious, blindsided, alternating between threatening litigation and attempting to portray himself as the heartbroken, abandoned husband. He hadn't, as far as I knew, connected any of this to Innovate Solutions yet. He was too consumed by his own wounded pride, his narrative of being wronged. The call I was both dreading and perversely anticipating came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't from Mark, but from Mr. Henderson's assistant. "Ms. Miller, Mr. Henderson would like to schedule a brief meeting with you and Mr. Mark Jessup. It concerns a potential conflict of interest regarding your investment in Innovate Solutions and Mr. Jessup's employment at our firm. Would tomorrow morning at 10 be suitable?" My blood ran cold. Conflict of interest. Mark. Together in Henderson's office. This was it. The climax. The carefully constructed walls between my old life and my new were about to come crashing down. "Yes," I managed, my voice surprisingly calm. "Tomorrow at 10 is fine." I hung up, my hand trembling. He knew. Mark knew. Or at least Henderson was about to make him know. The dry humor of the universe wasn't lost on me. Mark, who prided himself on his connections, his insider knowledge, was about to be confronted with a truth so outlandish, so far beyond his comprehension of who I was, that it would undoubtedly shatter his carefully curated world. I barely slept that night, my mind a whirlwind of potential scenarios. Would Mark explode? Would he try to discredit me, to paint me as vindictive, unstable? Would Henderson take his side? After all, Mark was his star employee, a rainmaker. I was a novice investor, an unknown quantity. But then I remembered the respect in Henderson's eyes at the dinner, Alex Chen's belief in me. I wasn't entirely powerless. The next morning, I dressed in the same charcoal gray pantsuit, my armor. I walked into the sleek, imposing lobby of Henderson's firm, the company where Mark had built his kingdom, the place from which he had lorded his superiority over me for so many years. It felt surreal. I was announced, and a moment later, Henderson's assistant escorted me to his large corner office. The view of the city was spectacular. Mr. Henderson stood up from behind his massive mahogany desk, his expression serious, unreadable. "Sarah, thank you for coming on such short notice." He gestured to one of the plush leather chairs facing his desk. And then, the door opened, and Mark walked in. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. His face, initially arranged in an expression of self-important anticipation, probably expecting a meeting about his next big bonus or promotion, crumpled into a mask of disbelief, then confusion, then a dawning, horrified outrage. "Sarah? What the hell are you doing here?" he spat, his voice a low, furious growl. He looked from me to Henderson, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What is this, Robert? Some kind of ambush?" Mr. Henderson held up a calming hand. "Mark, please sit down. There's something we need to discuss." Mark remained standing, his fists clenched, his glare fixed on me. "I'm not sitting anywhere until she explains what she's doing in my boss's office." "Actually, Mark," Henderson said, his voice firm, authoritative, Ms. Miller is here at my invitation. As it turns out, is Innovate Solutions, a company she recently invested in. Mark's jaw literally dropped. He stared at Henderson, then back at me, his face paling. Invested? What are you talking about? She doesn't know anything about investments. She can barely balance a checkbook. The familiar condescension. Even now, even in his shock. I remained silent, letting Henderson control the narrative. This was his office, his stage. Apparently, Mark, you underestimate your wife, Henderson said, a cool, almost amused glint in his eye. Ms. Miller made a significant seed investment in Innovate Solutions, a company, as you know, I personally advise and have a keen interest in. She came highly recommended by Alex Chun, their CEO, who was impressed by her due diligence and strategic insights. Mark looked like he'd been poleaxed. He sank into the chair opposite me, his face a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. Innovate Solutions, he stammered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. But how? Where did she get the money? That, Mark, is frankly none of your concern nor mine, Henderson said smoothly. The fact is, Ms. Miller is now a key stakeholder in a company that has strategic ties to our firm's interests in the tech sector. Which brings us to the conflict of interest. Mark was speechless. He just stared at me, his eyes wide, his mouth agape. The arrogant, dismissive husband, the man who had publicly mocked me, was utterly, completely blindsided. I could almost see the cogs in his brain whirring, trying to process this impossible reality. The wife he'd written off as a clueless dependent, the woman he'd taunted with "she can't even keep a man," was sitting across from him, an investor in a company connected to his own boss, a player in his world. The nature of Innovate Solutions' work in data security, Henderson continued, and our firm's potential future dealings with them, means that your personal situation with Ms. Miller presents a perception issue, Mark. And potentially, a very real conflict when it comes to proprietary information and unbiased decision-making. Mark finally found his voice, though it was strangled, hoarse. This is insane. She's doing this to ruin me. This is some kind of vindictive plot. He pointed a shaking finger at me. She's trying to destroy my career. I met his gaze, my expression cool, unruffled. Actually, Mark, I said, my voice calm and even. My investment in Innovate Solutions was based purely on its merits and my belief in its potential. My personal life is, and will remain, separate from my business decisions. Unlike some people, the barb hit its mark. He flinched. Henderson cleared his throat. Be that as it may, Mark, the optics are problematic. Given the acrimonious nature of your separation, and Ms. Miller's new role as a significant investor in a company of strategic importance, we have a problem. Mark looked desperately at Henderson. Robert, you can't be serious. She's nobody. This has to be some kind of mistake, a joke. It's no joke, Mark, Henderson said, his voice hardening. Ms. Miller's investment is very real. Her insights are valued. And the conflict is undeniable. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Frankly, Mark, this situation puts the firm in an awkward position. Your unprofessional conduct at the gala regarding Ms. Miller was already a concern. This new development, coupled with your increasingly erratic behavior reported by several colleagues regarding your marital situation. He trailed off, letting Mark fill in the blanks. Mark's face went from pale to a sickly green. He understood. His world was crumbling around him, not because of some grand conspiracy, but because of his own actions, his own arrogance, his own monumental underestimation of the woman he had married and dismissed. What are you saying? Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Henderson leaned back in his chair, his expression resolute. I'm saying, Mark, that we need to find a solution. And given the circumstances, and to protect the firm's interests and our relationship with Innovate Solutions and other partners in that ecosystem, one solution seems most straightforward. He paused, his gaze steady on Mark. We're going to have to reassign you. Effective immediately. You'll be moved off all accounts related to the tech sector, anything that could even peripherally touch upon Innovate Solutions or its competitors. Your access to certain sensitive information will be restricted. Mark stared at him, aghast. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was a significant demotion, a public neutering within the company. His specialty, his power base, was being stripped away. Furthermore, Henderson continued, his voice like ice, I expect you to conduct yourself with the utmost professionalism regarding Ms. Miller moving forward. Any attempt to harass, intimidate, or undermine her, or innovate solutions, will have severe consequences for your continued employment at this firm. Am I clear? Mark didn't speak. He just stared, his face a mask of shattered arrogance and dawning despair. The man who had mocked me for not being able to keep a man was now facing the implosion of his own career, orchestrated not by my malice, but by his own hubris and my quiet, unexpected confidence. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by Mark's ragged breathing. He looked at me then, truly looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. And in his eyes, I saw not just shock, but a flicker of something else. Fear. He had no power here. He had no leverage. He had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. The climax wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic accusation. It was this cold, quiet dismantling of his world, witnessed by the very man whose approval he so desperately craved. It was the ultimate, satisfying plot twist, and he hadn't seen it coming. He had thought he was the master of the universe. He had forgotten that even the smallest, most overlooked stars can eventually align to create a supernova. The aftermath of that meeting in Mr. Henderson's office was not an explosion, but a slow, quiet implosion of Mark's world. He stumbled out of Henderson's office looking like a man who had seen a ghost, or perhaps had become one.
He didn't look at me as he left.
He couldn't. The bravado, the arrogance, the casual cruelty, it had all been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell. Mr. Henderson, to his credit, was impeccably professional. He apologized for putting me in an awkward position, reiterated his firm's commitment to ethical conduct, and expressed his continued confidence in Innovate Solutions. He assured me that Mark's reassignment would be handled discreetly but firmly. As I left the building, stepping out into the bright sunlight, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was a grim satisfaction. Yes, a sense of vindication that was undeniably potent. He had publicly humiliated me, and now, in a far more significant arena, his own world had been rocked, his status diminished, not because I had sought revenge in kind, but because I had simply chosen to build something for myself, and his own actions had made that incompatible with his carefully constructed life. But beneath the satisfaction, there was also a profound sadness. Sadness for the marriage that had died so spectacularly, for the years I had wasted trying to be someone I wasn't, for the man Mark could have been if his ego hadn't consumed him. There was no joy in his downfall, not really. Just a quiet, somber recognition that this was the inevitable consequence of his choices, and of mine. The divorce proceeded much more smoothly after that. Mark, it seemed, had lost his fight. His threats of dragging things out, of contesting every point, evaporated. Perhaps his lawyer advised him that his position was untenable, or perhaps he simply lacked the energy, the will, to continue the battle. He was a diminished figure, stripped of his power base at work, his reputation tarnished not by my accusations, but by his own boss's clear disapproval and actions. He agreed to a settlement that was fair, surprisingly so. Maybe, in his defeat, a sliver of his former self, the one capable of reason, had resurfaced. Or maybe he just wanted me out of his life, a constant reminder of his monumental misjudgment. My life, in contrast, began to blossom. My investment in Innovate Solutions proved to be even more astute than I'd initially hoped. The company was thriving, Alex Chun and his team were brilliant, and I found myself genuinely engaged and respected as a board observer and strategic advisor. My insights, once dismissed by Mark, were now valued. I continued my freelance editing work, but my focus increasingly shifted to managing my growing investment portfolio and exploring other opportunities in the tech startup world. The tiny studio apartment, once a symbol of my desperation, became a cozy, vibrant home filled with books, research papers, and the quiet hum of my own endeavors. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones, people who valued me for who I was, not for who I was married to. There was a lightness to my days, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. I saw Mark once, a few months later, across a crowded street. He looked smaller, somehow. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a kind of weary resignation. He didn't see me, and I didn't try to catch his eye. There was nothing left to say. Our story was over. The lesson I learned wasn't about revenge, though the vindication was undeniably sweet. It was about the quiet power of self-belief, about the importance of nurturing your own talents, your own ambitions, even when the world, or the person closest to you, tries to diminish them. It was about understanding that true strength isn't about tearing others down, but about building yourself up, brick by painstaking brick. Mark thought he had the power to define me with his words, to reduce me to a punchline. But in the end, the only person he diminished was himself. My victory wasn't loud or explosive. It was the quiet, steady hum of a life well lived, a potential fulfilled, a narrative rewritten on my own terms. He had gasped when his boss introduced me as their new investor, a gasp that echoed the shattering of his illusions. And in that gasp, I found not just triumph, but freedom. The freedom to finally, truly be myself. If this story, this journey of reclaiming a voice and a life, resonated with you, I'd love to hear your version, your own tale of turning the tables or finding strength in unexpected places. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Your stories inspire me. And if you haven't already, subscribing really does help bring more of these narratives to life. Thanks for being here, for listening.